Welcome back, Curious Hearts. I'm Vera. Together, in every episode, we get to explore what it is we really believe, how we practice, and we get to meet people who are on their own spiritual path. Together, we begin. Welcome back, Curious Hearts. You are listening to episode 39, and this episode is about the practice of humility. This is one of those words that I think everybody thinks they understand, but if you ask them how to define it, they get caught up or stuck. And I think it's one of the most misunderstood concepts. And as a result, it can be very challenging to practice unless we unpack it just a little bit. Most people's understanding of humility comes in a sort of sneaky way from systems of power and systems of oppression. So what do I mean when I say systems of oppression? I mean things like patriarchy that says that men have more wisdom or more skill or capacity than women do. Or white supremacy that says that white people, people of European descent, are somehow superior and more capable, right? These are all really harmful systems. And if you live in the United States, you're sort of swimming in that all the time. One of the ways that humility has crept its way in is it's become a weapon for people who are trying to exert power over others. And so the best way to exert power over others is to force them to give up their autonomy, is to force them to defer to your decisions, your preferences, and your direction. Humility has been squeezed into this shape that says, listen to me, I know best, and you don't. And so humility is this, for many of us, it comes with some like trappings of like shame or messiness around the edges. We feel hesitant to it. And I think that is because we have this internal sense that it has been used as a tool not for our liberation or our freedom or our joy, but instead to restrict us. And that is not at all what humility is. Humility does not ask us to be small. It does not ask us to submit to others. Instead, humility has a way of being just really honest. I think the best way to understand humility is as this unbearable paradox. That moment when you realize how small you are, right? Even if we just look at there are 7 billion people on the planet right now, and you are one of 7 billion. 7 billion is such a huge number that we can't even put our finger on it, right? But if you took, let's say a square mile of sand, that potentially 1 grain of sand in that giant volume. We are so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And then if we look at the history of, the human species, and then before that, the history of the earth as we know it, right? Us being in this snapshot of a lifetime that is so irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Right? That on its own is not humility, but that does place us in an honest way of how extraordinary, how expansive, how broad and immense this reality is, and that we are really just this tiny, tiny fraction. And the paradox is that inside of how small and how minuscule we are, we still have the capacity to make extraordinary change. We have the ability to make changes and improvements and to directly impact the lives of all of the 7 billion people on the planet, all of the other beings on the planet, and potentially for generations and generations and generations to come. So that paradox of both how small we are and how powerful we are. Where those two things meet, I believe, is where humility exists. And so it's why we always talk about paradox as being an inherent spiritual principle. Because if you try to make sense of those two things in our brains just like kind of short, my brain does at least, my brain short circuits. So when we think about humility, we'll talk about how we actually practice it at the end of this episode. And I'm going to give you some things to think about. But first, I want to talk about humility in terms of two phases. The first stage, the first step in humility, I think, is assessing and evaluating our relationship to power. So in what circumstances do we have the ability to make change? That at its very core, that is what I understand power to be. Power says, I want this to be different, I can change it. Or I don't want this to be different, I can keep it the same. So whether that's like in your household, right? If you are in a position where you get to decide where you live, how you live, that's an example of your personal power. In communities, right? I don't have as much power in my community. I can't demand that we change the day the trash gets picked up, for example. But there are people who are in positions of power, like the mayor or the director of sanitation, who could potentially decide to make those changes, right? So in that setting, I am not as much in a system of power, right? I don't have that ability. So inside of our culture, there are lots of ways that power can evolve. And one is the most obvious one, which is our positional power, right? Are you in a position of leadership or authority where you get to make changes that influence other people's lives? You might instantly be like, no, I'm not that important. And the answer is all of us have this in different settings. But if you are a teacher, if you are a supervisor or a boss, if you are, on the way up like a company ladder, right? You are a person in positional power. Inside of your family dynamic, you may have positional power, for example, if you're a parent, and so forth, right? You understand kind of what that means. So there's our positional power. And then there are ways in which we have relational power. And that relational power is built over years. It's why our reputation is so important to us. Because when we have a reputation as being reliable, trustworthy, whatever, right? People tend to defer to us for decisions. So even if we don't have strong authority, right, or like direct power to make a change, we can influence that change. And so that relational power is significant, right? So even if you don't have the direct decision-making power in your organization, in your department, in your church, in your friend group, you might have the ear or the respect of someone who does have that decision-making power. And so as a result, you have relational power. Those are like two of the most important parts. We're not going down like a whole deep power analysis here, but these are really important things to think about. Because there are also ways, as I talked about at the beginning, that we have some sense of implicit or assumed power based on the quote unquote rules of the society that we live in. And so because here we are living in a patriarchal society where the majority of people in leadership are men, present as men, that men as a default are looked to as people who are more trustworthy or more reliable, right, to make decisions and plans, etc. So being a lady, I have less power in that dynamic. However, I am of European descent. My skin is lighter, right? And so I also live in a society in the United States that defaults to trusting people who look like me to take the lead or be an authority. There are lots of other ways that we get power and that we can wield our influence. Some of those are ones that we've worked for and that we've earned, and some of those are privilege. And for this context, it doesn't actually matter where they come from. What matters is that we have the ability to reckon with the ways that we have power and the ways that we don't have power. So we begin to build a relationship with our abilities to make change in our own lives, right? And for some of us, that is profound. So here's a way that like wealth and status, like the more financial resources we have, the more ability the more freedom we have, right, to make changes. So all of that, I think, is really essential because when we are in relationship and dynamic with others, it is never a simple evaluation about who has more, quote unquote, or less power in a certain dynamic. That it's really this whole network of tendrils of like who gets to decide where we go for dinner, what the annual budget is, what this law will be moving forward, right? There's like this whole network of power. So the very first step in humility is evaluating our relationship to power. Where do we have it and where do we not have it? And in the places where we have power or influence, what makes humility is a willingness to be teachable, a willingness to not always need to be correct or right. This is the part where it gets a little hazy and confusing, but I love this definition of humility, is that humility is our ability to be teachable. It's our ability to change our perspective, to change our point of view, to adjust our expectations and our priorities. So one of the best examples I have of this, and that I have lived, so many times, and have had to like reckon with all the time, is being a yoga teacher. And I love this story so much because I think it's so funny. I was teaching a yoga class once and I was sharing with my students this stupid thing I did. And, I'm like sitting on the sofa and like doing my Wordle, and I put my coffee cup on the back of the sofa. And obviously that is not a smart place to put it. And so my coffee cup spilled, and I was using that as an example of, I think, how my meditation practice helped me stay sane in the world when I do stupid stuff. And I was telling that story intentionally because when you are a yoga teacher, as soon as you get your yoga teacher training, as soon as you start teaching a yoga class, people start looking at you like you know something about the magic of the world. And it makes sense. So many people, including myself, many of my students, have had extraordinary experiences inside of a yoga class of feeling grounded, feeling peaceful, feeling connected to every other being in the room, feeling connected to something that was bigger than myself as a human, and feeling this deep sense of ease. And that feeling is so extraordinary and simple, but extraordinary, that in the beginning of our practice, it's really easy to think that the person who is leading the class is the person doing that to you, right? That they can deal out this sense of peace and ease and groundedness and connection anytime they want. And so they must have some magical power that I don't yet have. So there is this constant paradox when you're in that situation of having to remind your students that you are like just a human being who does stupid stuff like spill your coffee. And in that moment, I like at the end of this little chat I was having before we moved into our physical practice, one of my students said, "Ugh, it's just such a relief that you do the Wordle." And that example is my favorite because it gives you a sense of like how, I had been put on this pedestal as a person. I don't even know why doing the Wordle is like bringing me down to earth, but that, I spend all of my hours like meditating and in deep practice, and that I would never deign to, dabble in these like basic human distractions like the Wordle. which could not be further from the truth. But there is something about wanting to believe that a person who is in power over us, and right in that position. So here's where the rubber is meeting the road. Number one, I'm in a position of power over my students. When I am sitting in the front of a yoga class, they have deferred their agency to me, right? They can leave anytime, and they never actually have to do anything that I instruct them to do, but they do. And so that gives me a sense of power over them, right? Makes me even uncomfortable to say it or to think about it, right? And I want to argue back at it, but it's just true, right? As a teacher of anything, you have that kind of, you have that power. And when, especially in a spiritual setting or in a yoga setting or, in a therapeutic setting, right? So a therapist also has a tremendous amount of positional and relational power over other people. When we engage in that relationship from a student, right, or a client perspective, we really want the person on the other side to know something that we don't know. We want them to have answers. There is a part of us, I think, always that is looking for someone who has the easy formula for how to be happy and how to move in the world and how to get what we want and how to not suffer. And so anytime we get around someone who seems to have a little piece of that or who can share some of that with us, it's very tempting to defer more to that person, to allow that person to direct more and more about what we do, how we think, how we move in the world, the decisions that we make, right? To sort of willingly turn our power over to that person. I am now describing what happens inside of cults, right? And like why we see so many examples of spiritual teachers and leaders who abuse that power, whether they are intentionally malicious or not, but because they are humans who've lost contact with their own humility. Because once you are in that position, once you are in that role of being able to make a decision for someone else, you are able to influence someone else's thinking or movement patterns. You now have a responsibility to constantly and consistently remind yourself and others that you don't actually have all the answers. And when we lose contact with that is when power can become harmful. So that means inside of conversations, going back to this analysis of like my racial and class-based power, my like where I fall in sort of a gender power dynamic. That if I'm having a conversation with a person of color, that the world around us, internally, maybe unconsciously, I'm going to defer to, I'm going to think that the things that I already believe are correct. And potentially the person that I'm talking to, that person of color, may also have that same belief. And so my practice and like being in a humble state says, I don't know the answers here. I don't always know best. And it can be a very uncomfortable practice for many of us. Because for a lot of us, most of the time, our closely held beliefs, the things that we have been taught and we think about ourselves and the world, are connected to our identity. And so this is why humility is a spiritual practice and not just an interrelational practice. Humility is one of the doorways to make some space between our truest identity, our curious heart, our inner seeking, and our profoundly loving nature. And all of those things that we think about the world and ourselves, and like all of the things we've been told and taught, all the things that we believe, how we identify ourselves. That humility says, there might be some space here. And I am willing to allow what's outside of my truest curious heart, my truest nature, I'm willing to let it be a little softer. Humility also does not mean that we don't have beliefs or thoughts or identities. It is not a complete dismissal. It's not a complete casting off of all of those things. Instead, it says, I am willing to allow there to be movement there. I'm willing to change my mind about things. I'm willing to learn some more information, to identify that not only are there things that I don't know, there are things that I don't know that I don't know. And that wide open spaciousness can be incredibly uncomfortable. So uncomfortable to be like, oh, what if I'm wrong about this? What if I don't have all the information? What if there's more to this story that I don't know yet? Or for me, sometimes what's harder is what if there's more to this story that I will never know? That I'll never see the whole picture. And so I can never know why things have turned out the way that they have turned out. There is a sense of acknowledging our inability to control everything. Because for me, knowing things, like knowing everything and being right, are two of the ways that I try to control the world around me. Because if I know everything, then, I'm omniscient and I can never be hurt. It's like really what most elements of control are about. So maybe as I'm talking about this, you see the ways that, when humility leaves the room, we are left with a really dangerous recipe for abuses of power, for manipulation, for the dynamics of power structures to transition, to change into systems of oppression, right? That oppression says, I'm always right. I always know best. You do what I say. And so if we really want to deconstruct these systems of harming, these systems of oppression, it requires us first to build an intimate relationship with our own humility. Because until we are able to do that and we can cultivate it, number one, we can never serve as an example to anyone else, but also how could we ask anyone else to also do that? So how do we practice humility in the everyday world? How do we practice this in a spiritual way? The first thing that comes to my mind is actually something that comes from the 12-step tradition, and it's called the 7-step prayer. And in full disclosure, it's really the first place that I began to rumble with humility and began to navigate what it actually meant to be humble. And I'm so grateful for all that I learned there, and that what I was taught, that humility has often been confused with humiliation in our culture, and they could not be furthest from the truth. But at its deepest sense, the 7th-step prayer is this. It says, please help me to forget everything I think I know about this universe, about myself, and about this practice that is laid out in front of me. I'm paraphrasing. Help me forget everything I think I know, so that I may learn the true nature of what is here, and of who I am, and of where I'm being guided. And that prayer, however we rephrase it subtly, that prayer brings us back to a right-sized relationship between ourselves and other humans, and the divine presence that is available all the time. It is a a doorway back into a deep sense of surrender of our will, right? Our ego-driven ambition that says, I have to do this, I have to be this, or something terrible will happen. I have to know the end of the story. And instead, it allows us to soften our grip and to open up some space. And in that space is where divine inspiration lives. It is where compassion for others lives. In this space is where forgiveness lives. And I don't think we can have any of those things until we cultivate this practice of humility. So maybe take a moment and reflect if you are in a simple, easy place to do that, and think about something that you feel really right and righteous about right now. This is the place where humility gets uncomfortable, and I think it's important for us to practice being uncomfortable. So maybe there's someone in your life who's been doing something a certain way, and you really think they're doing it wrong. They're making the wrong decisions. They are screwing it up. Maybe you are seeing someone who is causing real harm to others. And what humility does not ask of us, it does not ask us to release our evaluating nature. Humility does not ask us to release our discernment about what is just and what is unjust. Instead, it says, maybe I don't know the whole picture. So keeping that same person in mind, is it possible that there is some other piece of information that you don't have, that if you had it, it would change your perspective? Sometimes we resist that softening to a change in perspective. Sometimes the grip that we have around knowing that we are correct is like a protection. It's like a shield. And if we soften it, we feel a sense of groundlessness. Maybe one of the easiest pathways in this circumstance, when we're thinking about a person who is really screwing something up, one of the ways that we can approach this is by saying, what if we knew for a fact that that person is doing the very best they can? And when we make that assumption, and it's a choice to make that assumption, when we make that assumption about other people, that they're doing the very best they can, that immediately shifts our entire orientation. And when our orientation shifts, our perspective shifts. So what if they're doing the very best they can is one of the doorways into humility. And one of the kindest questions we can ask, I believe, is, what if right now in this moment, in the state of the world, with everything going on in your life, what if you are doing the very best you can right now? In that moment, we are releasing the harsh condemnations of ourselves. We're releasing those absolute judgments. And when those absolute judgments are gone, then we have the ability to learn. Then we can be teachable. And then we can grow. And in the end, what else is the purpose of our spiritual practices except to help us to grow? To help us to grow into who we really are, to grow into the greatest versions of ourselves, into the most loving and honest and steadfast versions of ourselves, and to also to grow into the most compassionate and kind and committed versions of ourselves. Our spiritual practices directly feed our ability to show up in the world and make it better for ourselves and the people we love and for everyone we know and do not know yet. So in that way, I am incredibly grateful to be on this path with you. I thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in, Curious Hearts. If this episode was useful, I hope you'll follow the show or leave a review or share it with somebody who you think needs it. And if you're craving support on your own spiritual path or seeking some meaningful work, you can find ways to work with me at veralester.com. Otherwise, until next time, please stay grounded in that curiosity that you've got and keep turning towards what matters. See y'all soon.